It was not a request. It was a dismissal. For the 1000th time, Harriet Lockhart was made to feel like a ghost in her own life, a silent engine running a house that was not hers. Lady Honora Devereux did not even look at her, her attention fixed on the retreating back of her most prized guest, Philippa Jardine. "See that the scullery maid scrubs the claret stain from the Aubusson before it sets, Harriet. And tally the wine inventory. We cannot have such carelessness again." The carelessness had been Miss Jardine's own, a theatrical sweep of her arm while recounting a tedious story. But Harriet knew better than to say so. She simply murmured, "Yes, Lady Honora," and faded back into the shadows of the grand London townhouse. Earlier, as the footman had rushed forward with cloths, and the guests had cooed with performative sympathy, Harriet had knelt on the floor. She had ignored the drama, instead instructing the panicked young servant in a low, steady voice. "Salt, then cold water. Blot, do not rub." Her hands, competent and unadorned, had directed the first aid for the priceless rug. Across the room, amidst the clatter of voices, one person had watched her. Not the flustered guests, not her dismissive aunt. One person. Gideon Devereux. He was the master of this house, though he had been absent for 5 years, a formidable, quiet man, returned from the farthest reaches of the empire to find his family's affairs in disarray. He was Lady Honora's nephew, the source of her wealth and status, and he carried his power not with noise, but with an unnerving stillness. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, had followed Harriet's efficient movements on the floor. When she had risen, satisfied the immediate damage was contained, he had approached, his presence silencing the chatter around him. He was tall, built with the hard economy of a soldier, and his face was a mask of stern control, etched by sun and some private sorrow she could not name. He had looked past the beautiful, pouting Miss Jardine, his gaze settling on Harriet. "Who taught you that?" His voice was low, devoid of pleasantry. A simple, direct question that cut through the social performance. Harriet met his gaze without flinching. It was a strange feeling, to be truly seen. "My father, sir. He was a scholar. He believed in practical knowledge." "A scholar of what?" "Of many things, but he wrote a small volume on household chemistry, on the properties of salt and vinegar, of lye and sunlight." Gideon Devereux held her gaze for a second longer, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. It was not kindness. It was not pity. It was something harder and more respectful. Recognition. Then he had turned away, and the moment was over. The party had resumed its noisy course, and Harriet had once again become invisible. Now, standing in the silent hallway with her aunt's commands echoing in her ears, she clutched the small, worn book she kept in her apron pocket. It was her only inheritance from her father, a man who had filled her head with botany and numbers, but left her purse empty, casting her upon the charity of her mother's cousin, Lady Honora. For 6 years she had been that charity case, an unpaid secretary, a meticulous accountant for her aunt's extravagances, a manager of staff, a mender of linens, a polisher of silver. A daughter in function, a servant in status. She did her work with a quiet precision that rendered it and her invisible. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing. They were a currency she did not possess and could not afford to spend. Her currency was competence. It was all she had. And for one brief, startling moment, the master of the house had seen its value. The thought was a small, dangerous coal glowing in the cold grate of her life. The next morning, Harriet was summoned to the study. This was unusual. Lady Honora conducted all household business from her boudoir. The study belonged to Gideon Devereux. It smelled of old leather, pipe tobacco, and discipline. He was standing by the window, staring out at the grey London drizzle. He did not turn when she entered. "Lady Honora tells me you manage her accounts," he said, his voice as flat as the sky. "I do, sir." "She tells me you are diligent." Harriet remained silent. Diligence was a word one used for a beast of burden. He turned then, and the full weight of his attention was unnerving. "My aunt's ledgers show a state of affairs that is unsustainable. She spends without thought. Yet the household runs, the suppliers are paid, the staff is not in open revolt. That is your work." It was not a question. "I do what is required, sir." He gave a short, mirthless huff of breath. "You do more than is required. You pour water into a sieve. My aunt lives on a generous allowance from the estate, an allowance she exceeds by 20% every quarter. You have been masking the deficit, I surmise, juggling funds, deferring payments. Am I wrong?" Harriet's hands tightened at her sides. He saw everything. "I have endeavored to maintain the household's credit, sir, at the cost of your own peace of mind." He gestured to a chair. "Sit." She did, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. He remained standing, a predator circling a problem. "I am restructuring the family's finances. My aunt's allowance will be strictly managed. By me. She will no longer have access to the capital accounts." He paused. "She is displeased. She blames you for revealing the truth through your tidy books." Harriet's heart sank. Of course. Her careful competence had become a weapon used against her. She had balanced the books so perfectly that the imbalance was impossible for him to ignore. "This is no longer a tenable position for you, Miss Lockhart," he stated, his tone matter of fact. "My aunt's resentment will make your life here intolerable." Fear, cold and sharp, pierced her composure. To be cast out from here meant destitution. The workhouse. Or worse. She kept her face a placid mask, her breathing even. "Therefore," he continued, "I have a proposition. It is a business arrangement, nothing more." He walked to his desk and picked up a sheaf of papers. "I own an estate in the West Country, Alderbrook. It was my mother's home. It has been unoccupied for 10 years, managed by a local solicitor who is either inept or corrupt. It loses £500 a year. The house is falling into disrepair. The tenant farms are underperforming. My aunt wishes me to sell it." He looked at her, his eyes searching her face. "I will not sell it, but I cannot personally oversee its restoration. I am required on the continent for at least a year." He laid the papers on the desk. "I require a steward, someone honest, meticulous, and immune to local politics. Someone who understands husbandry and accounts. Someone who can live there, halt the decay, and make the estate solvent, within a strict budget." The air in the room grew thin. Harriet could hear the ticking of the mantel clock, each second a heavy drop into the pool of silence. "Why me?" she whispered. "Because you made a crumbling household in London function on charm and debt. Because you know the value of salt. Because you do not flatter. and because you have no other options." The last sentence was brutal in its honesty. He was not offering a kindness. He was offering a transaction to a person he knew was desperate. "The terms are these," he said, his voice returning to its clipped, businesslike cadence. "You will go to Alderbrook for 1 year. You will have full authority over the household and the estate accounts, reporting only to me, by weekly letter. Your budget for repairs and wages is detailed here. If, at the end of 1 year, you have made the estate profitable, or at the very least broken even, I will settle upon you an annuity of £200 a year, for life. You will be independent. You will never have to depend on the charity of my aunt or anyone else again." £200 a year. It was more than freedom. It was a kingdom. The possibility of it was so vast, it was terrifying. To have a life of her own choosing. To own her own days. "And if I fail?" she asked, her voice steady. "If you fail, you are left with nothing. The offer is rescinded. I will sell the estate, and you will have lost a year." He watched her, gauging her. "I do not expect you to fail, Miss Lockhart. I am a good judge of character." Honora's fury, when she was told, was a tempest. She accused Gideon of cruelty, of madness. She accused Harriet of scheming, of ambition, of bewicting him. Through it all, Harriet stood silent, a small, still point in the storm. Gideon did not argue. He simply stated, "It is done. She has accepted." The contract was drawn up by his solicitors. It was cold, precise, and binding. As Harriet signed her name, her hand perfectly steady, she felt a profound shift. For the first time in her adult life, she was not enduring. She was choosing. She was trading one form of servitude for a chance at liberation. As she looked up, she met Gideon's eyes across the polished mahogany of the desk. He gave a single, brief nod. It was the seal on their pact. A reluctant, unspoken alliance between two people who trusted competence more than they trusted feeling. A week later, with a single trunk and her father's book, she was on a coach, rattling west toward a decaying house and an unknown future, the gray streets of London receding behind her like a bad dream. The journey to Marley, the nearest town to Alderbrook, took 3 days. With every mile, the soot-stained brick of London gave way to rolling green hills and air that smelled of damp earth and livestock. Harriet felt a part of her, a part she had thought long dead, begin to stir. Her father had loved the country, had taught her the names of wildflowers and the habits of birds. She had spent the last 6 years in a cage of polite society, and she had not realized how starved her senses were. A carriage, arranged by Gideon's solicitor, was waiting to take her the final 5 miles. The driver, a taciturn man named Jem, pointed with his whip. "That be Alderbrook land, miss." She looked out at fields overrun with thistle and bramble, at dry stone walls that had crumbled into piles of mossy rock. It was worse than she had imagined. The estate was not sleeping. It was dying. The carriage turned onto a long drive, the gravel swallowed by weeds, the trees on either side overgrown and choked with ivy, their branches clawing at the sky. And then she saw the house. Alderbrook was a beautiful ruin. A Jacobean manor of honey-colored stone, it sat nestled in a shallow valley, its many-gabled roof dark with age and missing slates. Panes of glass in the mullioned windows were cracked or gone entirely, leaving dark, gaping eyes. It looked proud but profoundly sad, like a dowager who had fallen on hard times and lost the will to keep up appearances. The heavy oak door groaned open to reveal a woman who looked as weathered as the house. She was tall and bony, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her apron was clean, but frayed at the edges. "I am Mrs. Perkins," she announced, her voice raspy with disuse. "The housekeeper." Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, swept over Harriet, taking in her simple traveling dress, her unadorned hands, her lack of a lady's maid. The assessment was swift and, Harriet felt, unflattering. "I am Miss Lockhart," Harriet said, extending a hand. Mrs. Perkins looked at it for a moment before giving it a brief, dry shake. "Mr. Devereux's letter said to expect you. Said you'd be in charge." The last two words were laden with a skepticism so heavy it was almost an insult. "That is the arrangement," Harriet confirmed quietly. Mrs. Perkins led her into the great hall. A film of dust covered everything. The air was cold and musty, thick with the scent of decay and damp stone. Ghostly shapes of furniture huddled under dust sheets. Sunlight struggled through the grimy windows, illuminating dancing motes of dust. It was a mausoleum. "There's just me, my husband, who sees to the grounds when his rheumatics allow, and the girl from the village, Tilly, who helps when she can," Mrs. Perkins said, her tone daring Harriet to complain. "The master hasn't set foot here in a decade, not since the mistress passed. He sends the money. We keep the damp out as best we can. That's all." The mention of the late Mrs. Devereux hung in the air. This was a house sealed by grief. Harriet understood now. Gideon's reluctance to sell was not business. It was sentiment. This cold, hard man had a heart, and it was buried here at Alderbrook. "Thank you, Mrs. Perkins," Harriet said. "Could you show me to my room? And then I would like to see the account books." The housekeeper's eyebrow twitched. She had expected complaints, perhaps tears. She had not expected a request for ledgers. The next few weeks were a battle fought on 100 fronts. Harriet rose before dawn and went to bed long after the sun had set. Her father's book was her constant companion. She did not issue grand commands from a drawing room. She worked. She started in the kitchens, taking inventory of the pantries, discovering stores of preserved goods that had been forgotten for years. She worked with Mrs. Perkins to scrub away the grime, her own hands raw from lye soap. She found the old house linens, yellowed and stiff in their chests. Instead of demanding new ones, she spent an evening showing the housekeeper a method from her father's book for boiling them with lemon and sunlight to restore their whiteness. Mrs. Perkins watched, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. But the next day, a cup of hot tea appeared at Harriet's elbow as she pored over the ledgers. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a truce. The account books were a testament to neglect. The previous solicitor had been paying inflated prices to his own cronies in Marley for supplies. The tenant farmers, discouraged by absentee ownership, were paying their rents late, if at all. Harriet spent her first 2 weeks walking the estate, visiting each tenant. She didn't threaten. She listened. She heard tales of leaking roofs, of fields that needed draining, of broken fences. She took meticulous notes. Her first weekly report to Gideon Devereux was 3 pages of concise, factual prose. It detailed the state of the house, the corruption in the accounts, and the condition of the tenant farms. She outlined a plan. Fire the Marley suppliers, buy directly from the farmers, and use the estate's own timber for repairs. She proposed a system of rent abatement in exchange for labor to fix the fences and drain the fields. She ended the letter simply, The decay is significant, but the foundation is sound. I believe it can be made solvent." She did not expect a lengthy reply, and she did not receive one. His letter, which arrived a fortnight later, was a single sheet. "Proceed as you have outlined. Your authority is absolute in these matters. Inform me of the solicitor's dismissal when it is done." But at the bottom, a postscript in his tight, controlled hand. "My mother favored climbing roses on the south-facing wall. Are they still there?" Harriet walked to the south side of the house. A tangled, thorny mess of woody stems clung to the stone, choked with weeds. But there, near the top, a single, defiant bud of deep crimson was preparing to open. She looked at it for a long time. She thought of the cold man in London, and the wife he had buried here, and the house that held his grief. Her work here was not just about balancing books. It was about tending to a garden and to a memory. In her next report, after detailing the renegotiated price of grain and the beginning of repairs on the tenant cottages, she added a final sentence. "The roses are still here. They are overgrown, but they are alive." Months turned with the seasons. Autumn's chill gave way to the hard frost of winter, then the slow, wet thaw of spring. Alderbrook was stirring from its long slumber. The house no longer felt like a tomb. The windows were clean, the floors polished with beeswax, and fires crackled in the hearths. Mrs. Perkins had unswathed the furniture, and the soft glow of the wood seemed to warm the rooms. Her husband, his rheumatics soothed by a liniment of Harriet's devising, led a small team repairing the roof and fences. Tilly, the village girl, now worked full-time and was learning to read from Harriet in the evenings. Harriet's greatest triumph was the walled kitchen garden. It had been a wilderness of nettles and collapsed cold frames. She had spent the winter planning, drawing on her father's knowledge of crop rotation and companion planting. She had ordered heritage seeds and rootstock from a specialist supplier in Bath, a significant expense she justified in her report to Gideon as a long-term investment in self-sufficiency. Come spring, she was out there every day, her hands in the dirt, directing the work of turning the soil and planting the neat rows. Mrs. Perkins would watch from the kitchen window, shaking her head, but the meals were now graced with fresh herbs and then tender spring greens. The house was beginning to feed itself. The weekly letters to Gideon became a ritual. They were the spine of her lonely existence, a single thread connecting her to the world beyond Alderbrook. Her reports remained professional, focused on numbers and progress, but slowly, a different kind of communication began to flow between the lines. He would ask a question, and she would answer, and in the answering, she would reveal a piece of herself. "The new ledgers are a model of clarity," he wrote. "Where did you learn such a system?" "My father believed a well-ordered mind was reflected in a well-ordered page," she replied. "He taught me that numbers tell a story, if you know how to read them." Another time, after she described the discovery of a small library of books on botany, he wrote, "List the titles for me." She did, and his next letter contained a question about a specific, obscure text on apple grafting. A quiet conversation was unfolding, conducted across hundreds of miles, a dialogue of shared intelligence. She found herself looking forward to the arrival of the post, her heart giving a small, traitorous leap when she saw his familiar, decisive script. She told herself it was merely the satisfaction of a job well done, of a superior pleased with his employee. But as she stood in the flourishing garden one May afternoon, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of apple blossoms, she admitted a different truth. She was not just restoring his house. She was building a home. And she was dangerously close to wishing he were here to see it. This quiet contentment was not to last. In London, Lady Honora Devereux was nursing a bitter grievance. Her allowance was curtailed, her social standing diminished without Gideon's presence to bolster it. She saw Harriet not as a poor relation given a chance, but as a usurper who had stolen her nephew's favor. Philippa Jardine, her ambitions for a match with the wealthy Gideon Devereux thwarted by his absence, was only too happy to fan the flames. "It is unseemly, Honora," Philippa would say over tea. "A young, unmarried woman, living alone as mistress of a great house. What must people think? And the sums of money he has placed at her disposal. It is a scandal waiting to happen." The gossip began as a trickle, then became a flood. In her letters to Gideon, Philippa would include seemingly innocent remarks. "We hear such wonderful news of Alderbrook's revival. Miss Lockhart must be a miracle worker. Though some do say she is putting on airs, spending rather extravagantly to play the grand lady." Honora was more direct. "Dearest Gideon, I worry for you. You have placed too much trust in this girl. She is clever, I grant you, but she has no breeding. I hear she is running the estate into debt with fanciful projects, ordering expensive plants from God knows where. You must send someone to look at the books, for your own protection." For months, Gideon ignored their insinuations. Harriet's reports were models of fiscal responsibility. The numbers were clear, the progress undeniable. The estate, which had been losing £500 a year, was now on track to show a small profit. But the constant drip of poison began to have an effect, seeding a tiny, cold splinter of doubt in his mind. He had been betrayed before. His trust was not a gift easily given or held. The opposition escalated from slander to a direct attack. Citing her concern as his closest elder relative, Honora announced she was dispatching an independent auditor to Alderbrook to ensure all was in order. She did not ask Gideon's permission. She presented it as a fait accompli, a sensible precaution any loving aunt would take. The man she chose was a London accountant named Fletcher, a man whose loyalty was not to his profession, but to whoever paid him most handsomely. Mr. Fletcher arrived at Alderbrook on a crisp October day. He was a small, precise man with a thin smile and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He was polite, even complimentary about the obvious improvements to the house and grounds. But Harriet felt a chill in his presence. He was not there to appreciate her work. He was there to find a flaw. "Lady Honora has asked me to make a thorough review of your accounts, Miss Lockhart," he said, settling himself at the desk in the small estate office Harriet had created. "A mere formality, I assure you." For 3 days, he went through her ledgers. Harriet gave him everything: her books, the files of receipts, the tenants' rent rolls. She had nothing to hide. Her accounting was immaculate. On the third afternoon, he called her into the office. The thin smile was gone, replaced by an expression of grave concern. "Miss Lockhart," he began, steepling his fingers, "I seem to have found a rather significant discrepancy." He tapped a page in the ledger. "There is an entry here from April, a payment of £50 to a nursery in Bath, a very large sum for seeds and supplies. Yet when I cross-reference the weekly household expenditures, I find no corresponding influx of goods on that scale. £50 is a great deal of money, enough to raise questions." Harriet's blood ran cold. "The purchase was for heritage fruit tree rootstock and specialized seeds for the kitchen garden," she explained calmly. "It was a capital investment, intended to make the estate self-sufficient in produce for decades to come. I noted as much in my weekly report to Mr. Devereux." "Ah, yes," Fletcher said, pulling a piece of paper from his valise. "The report. But what I have here is the supplier's receipt,
which Lady Honora's man procured from the nursery itself. It lists the purchase as various floral sundries, a rather vague description for such a cost. It looks, you must admit, like an attempt to disguise a personal extravagance. He pushed the receipt across the desk. It looked official. The name of the nursery was correct, but the description was a lie. "That is not what I purchased," Harriet said, her voice low and tight. "And that is not the receipt they gave me. I have the original." Fletcher's smile returned, full of pity. "My dear Miss Lockhart, it is so easy to become confused. But this document, and the testimony of the supplier, will be difficult to explain. I'm afraid my report to Mr. Devereux will have to reflect this irregularity."
It appears a sum of £50 has been embezzled. The word hung in the air, ugly and venomous. Embezzled. It was an accusation of theft, a crime. It was the end of everything. All her hard work, all her meticulous care, twisted into a lie by a forged piece of paper and a paid-for slander. Honora had finally found a way to destroy her. Fletcher packed his valise, his work done, leaving Harriet standing alone in the office, the world tilting beneath her feet. Gideon received the auditor's report in a stuffy merchant's office in Lisbon. He read Fletcher's neat, damning prose, and a familiar, cold sickness washed over him. Betrayal. It was the story of his life. His business partner who had swindled him years ago, the friends who had revealed themselves to be sycophants. He had allowed himself to trust this quiet, competent woman. He had allowed himself to believe in her integrity. He had read her letters and pictured her moving through the rooms of his mother's house, bringing it back to life. He had even, in quiet moments, allowed himself to feel a flicker of warmth, of admiration. And now this. His instinct, honed by years of disappointment, was to believe the worst. The evidence seemed clear. The receipt, the auditor's professional opinion, his aunt's persistent warnings. He felt like a fool. A cold, black anger rose in him. He took out a sheet of paper and his pen. The letter he wrote was brutal in its brevity. "A report from Mr. Fletcher has reached me. It details a missing sum of £50, attributed to you. An invoice has been produced that contradicts your ledger. Account for this. Plainly." He signed it simply, G. Devereux. No salutation, no closing. It was a demand from a master to a suspected thief. The letter arrived at Alderbrook on a wind-swept afternoon a week later. Harriet recognized his handwriting, and her heart, for a moment, lifted. Then she opened it. The words were like stones, each one a blow. Account for this. Plainly. The coldness of it was worse than any shouted accusation. It was the coldness of withdrawn trust, of a door slammed shut. All the fragile, unspoken connection that had grown between them over the months, all the shared understanding she had dared to imagine, vanished in the face of those two stark sentences. For a long moment, she felt the sting of tears behind her eyes. The urge to weep, to despair, was overwhelming. She thought of the injustice, of Honora's viciousness, of Fletcher's smirking lies. She thought of her year of tireless work, of the calluses on her hands and the numbers perfectly balanced in her head. She thought of the single crimson rose on the south wall. She straightened her shoulders. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing. Integrity was not defended with emotion, but with fact. She went to her desk. Her hands were perfectly steady. She would not write a long, pleading defense. She would not rail against her accusers. She would meet his demand with the same plainness he had used. She took out a fresh sheet of paper. "Sir," she wrote, "the funds were used to purchase 24 heritage apple and pear rootstocks and a comprehensive selection of perennial vegetable seeds, as outlined in my report of April 12th. This was a foundational investment for the long-term viability of the estate, intended to generate income and reduce household expenditure for years to come. The receipt provided by Mr. Fletcher is a forgery. I enclose the original invoice from the Bath nursery, which you will note is on watermarked paper they reserve for agricultural orders. I also enclose my own detailed ledger page for the month of April. Finally, I enclose a pressed leaf from one of the apple trees planted with those funds. It is a Howgate wonder, known for its resilience and productivity. My accounts are correct. My integrity is my own. I will await your judgment." She folded the letter, along with the invoice, the ledger page, and the small, perfect leaf. She sealed the envelope and gave it to the postboy herself. As he rode away, she felt a strange calm settle over her. She had done the work. She had told the truth. The rest was out of her hands. She had placed her faith not in his kindness, but in the belief that this man, this cold, rational man, valued evidence above all else. If she was wrong about that, then she was wrong about everything. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. In Lisbon, Gideon Devereux held Harriet's letter in his hands. He read it once, then he read it again. He laid her enclosed documents out on his desk. The crisp, original invoice with its distinctive watermark. The ledger page, a work of art in its clarity and detail, and the small, pressed apple leaf. He picked up the leaf. It was so fragile, yet so real. A Howgate wonder. He remembered his father talking about them, resilience and productivity. Was she describing the tree or herself? He compared the forged receipt from Fletcher with the original from Harriet. The differences, once you looked for them, were glaring. The paper was cheaper. The ink was different. The signature was a clumsy imitation. Fletcher and Honora had not counted on her keeping the original. They had not counted on her meticulousness. And they had not counted on him looking closer. A slow, cold fury began to build in him, different from the anger he had felt before. This was not the anger of personal betrayal. It was the anger of witnessing an injustice. He had sent this woman to do an impossible job, and she had succeeded through sheer force of will and intelligence. And for her efforts, his own family had tried to ruin her, to brand her a common thief. He looked at her final words. "My integrity is my own. I will await your judgment." She was not pleading. She was standing her ground, armed with nothing but the truth. In that moment, something inside Gideon Devereux shifted permanently. The wall of cynical detachment he had built around his heart for a decade began to crumble. He had demanded plain speaking, and she had delivered it. He had demanded evidence, and she had provided it. She had met his test, and in doing so, had turned the judgment back on him. What kind of man was he? One who believed the honeyed lies of his greedy aunt, or one who recognized the quiet, unyielding truth of a woman like Harriet Lockhart? He stood up, his decision made. His business in Lisbon could wait. He wrote 2 brief, urgent letters. One was to his most trusted agent in London, a man of immense discretion, instructing him to go to Bath and speak directly with the proprietor of the nursery. The second was to the magistrate in Marley, a sharp old man named Simon Ellery, requesting his presence at Alderbrook in 1 week's time for a matter of grave estate business. He did not write to Harriet. His response would not be a letter. It would be an action. He booked passage on the next ship bound for England, a storm gathering in his winter sky eyes. Harriet lived through the next 10 days in a state of suspended animation. She continued her work, her movements as precise and methodical as ever. She oversaw the autumn harvest. She tallied the accounts for the month. She met with the tenants. But underneath, a terrible uncertainty hummed. She listened for the sound of the postboy's horse, dreading and longing for a letter that never came. The silence from Gideon was its own kind of answer, and she began to prepare herself for the worst. Dismissal, disgrace. She would leave Alderbrook with nothing but the clothes on her back, her name ruined. The thought was a physical ache in her chest. Then, one afternoon, a carriage came up the drive. Not the mail coach, but a smart black traveling chaise pulled by 2 powerful horses. It stopped before the house, and the door opened. Gideon Devereux stepped out. He looked different than he had in London. Thinner, perhaps, his face harder, but there was a new intensity in his gaze as he looked at the house. He took in the repaired roof, the clear windows, the neat gravel on the drive. He saw the smoke rising from the chimneys. He saw that it was alive. Mrs. Perkins rushed out, her face a mixture of shock and awe. Harriet simply stood in the doorway, her heart hammering against her ribs. He walked toward her, his eyes never leaving her face. He stopped a few feet away. "Miss Lockhart," he said, his voice quiet. "Mr. Devereux, we were not expecting you." "I came as soon as I was able," he said. "There is a matter that requires my personal attention. I have summoned my aunt, my sister, and Mr. Fletcher to join us here tomorrow. Mr. Ellery, the magistrate, will also be in attendance." The names fell into the quiet air like stones. Honora, Fletcher, a magistrate. It was to be a trial. Her trial. She met his gaze, searching for some sign, some hint of his intent. But his face was an unreadable mask. The next day, the great hall at Alderbrook, once a dusty cavern of ghosts, was filled with a tense, living silence. Sunlight streamed through the tall, clean windows, illuminating the rich colors of the polished wood and the newly hung tapestries. A fire crackled in the great hearth. Harriet had made this room beautiful again, and now it was to be the stage for her humiliation. She stood near the fireplace, a small, still figure in a simple gray dress. Lady Honora sat in a large armchair, radiating smug triumph. Philippa Jardine was beside her, looking bored and beautiful. Lavinia, Gideon's younger sister, fidgeted nervously, looking from her aunt to Harriet with wide, uncertain eyes. Mr. Fletcher, the auditor, stood by the window, clutching his valise. In a chair by the long table sat Simon Ellery, the magistrate, a hawk-faced man in his 70s, with eyes that missed nothing. And presiding over it all was Gideon. He stood before the hearth, a commanding, implacable presence. He let the silence stretch, forcing them all to feel the weight of the moment. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice calm but edged with steel. I have called you here to resolve a serious accusation made against a member of my staff. Mr. Fletcher, you will please present your findings to the magistrate." Fletcher stepped forward, clearing his throat. He laid out the case with practiced ease, presenting the story of the £50 discrepancy, the vague description on the invoice he had procured, and his professional conclusion of embezzlement. He avoided looking at Harriet. Lady Honora nodded along, a faint, cruel smile on her lips. When he was finished, Gideon turned to the magistrate. "A serious charge." "Indeed," Mr. Ellery said, his sharp eyes moving to Harriet. "Miss Lockhart, what do you have to say in your defense?" All eyes were on her. The silence was absolute. Harriet took a small breath, her voice, when it came, clear and steady. "The accusation is false. The money was spent on rootstock and seeds as a long-term investment in the estate's future. The receipt Mr. Fletcher has produced is a forgery." Honora gave a theatrical gasp. "The impudence! To accuse a respected professional of forgery!" Gideon held up a hand, silencing her instantly. "Evidence, Aunt, not hysterics." He turned to Harriet. "You claim the receipt is forged. On what grounds?" "I retained the original invoice, sir," Harriet said. She walked to the table and laid down the document she had sent him. "As Mr. Ellery can see, it is on the nursery's official watermarked paper. It details the exact agricultural items purchased. The document Mr. Fletcher holds is on plain paper." Fletcher's face paled slightly. "A clerical error on the nursery's part, no doubt." "No," Gideon said, his voice dropping, becoming dangerously quiet. "Not an error. A crime." He produced a new document from his coat. "This is a sworn statement from the proprietor of the Royal Bath Nursery, taken 3 days ago by my agent. He states that he was visited by a man claiming to work for Lady Honora Devereux." He looked directly at his aunt, whose smile had vanished. "This man offered him a bribe of £10 to create a false receipt for floral sundries and to corroborate the story if asked. The proprietor, an honest man, refused. The man then apparently found a less scrupulous clerk to create the forgery. The proprietor's statement includes a detailed description of the man who tried to bribe him." Gideon's eyes moved, cold and hard, to Fletcher. "He is described as being short, with a thin smile, and wearing a rather distinctive green waistcoat." Fletcher looked down at his green waistcoat as if seeing it for the first time. A choked sound escaped his lips. The magistrate, Mr. Ellery, leaned forward. "Mr. Fletcher, is this true?" Fletcher began to stammer, sweating profusely. "A misunderstanding. I was merely following instructions." "Whose instructions?" Gideon's voice was a lash. Fletcher's eyes darted to Lady Honora. Her face had turned a mottled, furious red. "This is an outrage. This servant girl has twisted you around her finger, Gideon." "Be silent," Gideon commanded, and the authority in his voice was absolute. He turned to his younger sister. "Lavinia, you were present when Aunt Honora and Miss Jardine discussed their plan to be rid of the drab little accountant. You wrote to me about it, did you not? In a moment of conscience." Lavinia shrank back, terrified, looking at her aunt's murderous expression. But then she looked at Harriet, standing alone, her dignity intact. After a long, trembling pause, she gave a tiny nod. "Yes," she whispered. They spoke of it for weeks. They said Miss Lockhart was getting above her station." It was done. The truth was out, laid bare in the sunlit room. Philippa Jardine rose, her face a mask of contempt. "This is all terribly dull. I have no part in this squalid family drama." She swept out of the room without a backward glance. Fletcher was sputtering, pleading with the magistrate, but Gideon's attention was fixed on his aunt. "How long has this been going on?" he asked, his voice low and full of a terrible, quiet rage. "This feeding on the vulnerable. You took Miss Lockhart in, not out of charity, but to use her as an unpaid servant. And when she proved too competent, you tried to destroy her reputation and cast her out. All for the sake of your own vanity and greed." Honora stared at him, her face contorted with hate. "She is a nobody, and you chose her over your own family. She has more honor in her little finger than you have in your entire life," Gideon said, his voice flat and final. He turned to the magistrate. "Mr. Ellery, I leave Mr. Fletcher to you. As for my aunt, she will be returning to London, on a much reduced allowance. She will not be welcome at Alderbrook again." He looked at Harriet, and for the first time, the mask was gone. His eyes were filled with a raw, profound respect. The public reckoning was over. Her vindication was complete. The disgraced guests departed. Fletcher was taken by the magistrate for questioning. Lady Honora, shrouded in a veil of fury, was bustled into her carriage without another word. Lavinia, weeping, apologized to Harriet in a rush of words before being sent to her room. At last, the great hall was quiet again. Only Gideon and Harriet remained, standing in the afternoon light. The fire crackled. The house seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. Gideon walked to the window and looked out at the grounds, at the orderly fields and the mended walls. He looked toward the walled garden, where the last of the autumn roses still bloomed. "You did this," he said, his voice soft. He turned to face her. "Not with money, but with care, with intelligence." "You brought it back to life." Harriet said nothing. She simply watched him, her heart a confusion of relief, exhaustion, and a fragile, burgeoning hope. He walked toward her until he stood directly before her. He looked at her not as a master to a servant, not as a wealthy patron to a poor relation, but as a man looks at a woman he finally, truly sees. "The contract," he said, his voice formal again, but with a new, deeper timbre. "It stipulated 1 year of service. That year is almost complete. You have more than fulfilled your side of the agreement. The estate is solvent. The annuity of £200 a year is yours. It will be settled upon you immediately. You are free, Miss Lockhart. You are free to leave." He said the words she had longed to hear for a lifetime. You are free. She could go anywhere. She could have her own small cottage, her own life, beholden to no one. But as she looked around the beautiful, breathing hall, and then out the window at the garden she had nurtured from a wasteland, a different truth settled in her soul. Leaving felt not like freedom, but like exile. "This is my home now," she said, the words quiet but firm. "I do not wish to leave." A long, profound silence filled the space between them. Gideon's carefully constructed composure seemed to fracture. The control he held so tightly finally gave way, not in a torrent of words, but in a single, stunning action. He went down on one knee before her. It was not the gesture of a supplicant begging for a favor, but of a knight swearing an oath. It was a formal, solemn declaration. "Then stay," he said,
his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. He looked up at her, his winter sky eyes now blazing with a fierce, open devotion. Stay. Not as my steward, not as my employee. He reached out and took her hand, his touch both gentle and sure. Stay as my wife, Harriet. Help me bring this house and myself back to life. Together. He had not said, "I love you." He had said something far more powerful. He had acknowledged her work, her worth, and had asked her to be his partner. It was a proposal built on a foundation of respect, not rescue. Tears she had refused to shed in her darkest moments now welled in her eyes, tears of joy. She looked down at this proud, guarded man, now kneeling before her, offering her not just his name and his fortune, but his broken, open heart. She remembered his cold, demanding letters. Plainly, she asked, a small smile touching her lips as she echoed his own word back to him. A slow, genuine smile transformed his face, erasing the last of the harsh lines. Plainly, he confirmed. She tightened her hand around his. Yes, she said. Together. 2 years later, the laughter of children echoed in the halls of Alderbrook. The house was no longer just alive, it was joyful. Mrs. Perkins, now a doting, grandmotherly figure, presided over a bustling household, her face creased with a permanent, contented smile. Lavinia, chastened and matured, was a frequent visitor, her admiration for Harriet now deep and sincere. Even Mr. Ellery, the gruff magistrate, had become a regular Sunday dinner guest, delighting in debating points of law and horticulture with the mistress of the house. On a warm June afternoon, Gideon and Harriet walked in the walled garden. It was a paradise of order and abundance. Bees hummed among the lavender, and the air was sweet with the scent of climbing roses, the descendants of the single, defiant bud she had found on her first day. Their son, a sturdy toddler with his father's serious eyes, chased a butterfly down a path. Harriet paused by a bench where a familiar, worn book lay open. Her father's book on household management. It was no longer her secret shield, but a shared treasure. Gideon picked it up, his hand brushing hers. "He would have been proud of you," Gideon said quietly, looking from the book to her face. "He would have liked you," Harriet replied.
"You appreciate evidence." Gideon smiled, that rare, true smile that she alone could draw from him. "I appreciate you." He drew her close, his arm around her waist, and they stood together, watching their son. The symbol of her servitude had become the foundation of her happiness. The quiet, competent woman who had arrived at a decaying house in disgrace was now its heart, the partner of the man who had seen her worth when no one else had. She was not just seen, not just valued. She was home. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.